4 astronauts just came back from the moon, and they did it strapped inside a spacecraft with a known, documented, unfixed flaw in the one system that stands between them and a 5,000-degree fireball. Let that sink in. This is not speculation. This is not a theory. This is what NASA's own engineers, NASA's own Inspector General, and a former NASA astronaut publicly said before those 4 people launched into space on April 1st, 2026. And I have to tell you, when I first dug into this story properly, I had to go back and read it several times. Because what happened here, the decisions that were made, the warnings that were raised and then essentially set aside, this should be talked about far more than it is. So let me take you through all of it right now. Because the Orion capsule named Integrity has just splashed down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego. The crew is safe, but the heat shield has been pulled out of the water, and the inspection is already underway. And what they find on that heat shield in the coming days matters enormously, not just for the people who just flew, but for every single astronaut who is supposed to fly after them. So let me start at the beginning. Because this story actually begins back in 2022. NASA launched Artemis I in November 2022. No crew, unmanned. A test flight around the moon and back. It was supposed to be a triumphant moment. Proof that the new space launch system worked. Proof that the Orion capsule could survive the journey. And the capsule did come back. But when recovery teams pulled it out of the Pacific and started inspecting it, they found something that genuinely alarmed NASA's most experienced engineers. The heat shield was damaged, not in a small way, not in a way they had predicted, not in a way their computer models had simulated. More than 100 separate locations on the heat shield had cracked and broken off during re-entry. More than 100 chunks of protective material, gone, scattered into the atmosphere somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. And here is what makes this particularly serious. The heat shield is not just important, it is irreplaceable during re-entry. There is no backup. There is no abort option at that point in the flight. If the heat shield fails catastrophically, there is no escape mechanism. The mission is lost. The crew is lost. Full stop. So you now understand why those 100+ damaged sites triggered alarm inside NASA. And further down in this video, I will explain exactly what is physically happening inside that heat shield when it breaks, and why the engineers who raised the loudest warnings believed NASA did not fully understand the problem before they put 4 people on top of that rocket. But first, let me give you the scale of what these 4 astronauts actually flew through. Artemis II launched on April 1st, 2026. Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Koch, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen. They flew around the moon on a free return trajectory. They broke Apollo 13's distance record. They reached 252,756 miles from Earth. That is roughly 406,000 kilometers, the farthest any human being has ever traveled from this planet. And then they turned around and came home. On April 10th, 2026, the Orion capsule hit the upper atmosphere at 24,161 miles per hour. That is Mach 33, 33 times the speed of sound. Fast enough to cross the entire continental United States in about 6 minutes, and the heat shield had to hold. It had to hold for 13 minutes. That is what Flight Director Jeff Radigan said publicly before re-entry. 13 minutes of things that have to go right. Give this video a like right now, guys. Share it. This story deserves to be seen by more people. It doesn't cost you a thing, and it helps this channel enormously. So now let me tell you exactly what that heat shield is and why it cracked. The shield is 16.5 feet across, about 5 meters in diameter. It sits at the bottom of the Orion capsule and faces the Earth during re-entry. It is coated in a material called AvCoat. AvCoat was originally developed for the Apollo program in the 1960s. It is made of silica fibers, and it is designed to ablate. That is the scientific term, to gradually burn, char, and shed during re-entry. Think of it like this. Imagine a slow-burning sacrificial layer. It heats up. The outer surface chars. That char carries the heat away from the capsule as it breaks off and disperses. The crew inside stays cool. That is how it is supposed to work. The key word there is supposed. Because during Artemis I, something different happened. NASA used a re-entry technique called skip re-entry for the first time. The capsule dipped into the upper atmosphere, used drag to slow down, then skipped back out into space like a stone skipping across water. Then it came back in for the final descent. And during that brief period between the two dips, something went wrong inside the heat shield. The outer surface of the AV coat cooled down during the skip, but the interior of the material was still hot, still generating gases. Those gases needed to escape outward through the surface, but the surface had cooled and tightened. It could no longer breathe. That is the word NASA used. The material literally could not breathe, so the gas pressure built up inside, and built up, and built up, until the outer layer cracked, and chunks broke off, over 100 times across the surface of the shield. This is not like tiles falling off a roof during a storm. This is structural failure of the most critical safety system on a crewed lunar spacecraft. Now. Here's where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable. When NASA found this damage after Artemis I, Artemis II's heat shield had already been installed, attached to the capsule in July 2023, before the Artemis I investigation was even complete. And here is the detail that is truly remarkable. The Artemis II heat shield is actually less permeable than the Artemis I heat shield, less able to vent gases, because NASA had intentionally made it that way. The design decision was made early in the program to use a tighter, less porous AV coat layer to make bond strength testing easier. And that decision was made before anyone knew that gas permeability would turn out to be the exact failure mechanism. So when the investigation came back and said the problem was that gases couldn't vent, NASA was sitting there looking at a spacecraft whose heat shield had even less ability to vent gases than the one that had just been damaged. Right. So the question became, do you replace it or do you fly it? Replacing it would mean delays of more than a year. A program already years behind schedule. A program that had cost over $90 billion and was under enormous political pressure to deliver results. NASA made the decision to fly. But they changed the reentry trajectory. Instead of the skip reentry that caused the problem on Artemis I, they switched to a steeper, more direct approach. The logic was counterintuitive. More heat, applied more consistently, would keep the outer char layer active and venting throughout the descent. No cooling pause, no trapped gas, no cracking. They tested this in arc jet facilities at NASA's Ames Research Center in California. They modeled it, they analyzed it. And NASA's Associate Administrator Amit Kshatriya stated publicly, and I will paraphrase here, that the engineering supported it, the Artemis I flight data supported it, the ground tests supported it, and Artemis II Commander Reed Wiseman himself said they had high confidence in the heat shield, but not everyone agreed, not everyone at all. Dr. Charles Camarda, former NASA astronaut, heat shield expert, research scientist, former senior advisor for innovation at Johnson Space Center. A man who flew on the very first space shuttle mission after the Columbia disaster in 2003, specifically because of his expertise in inspecting heat shield integrity. This man wrote an open letter to NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman. He wrote that NASA did not truly understand the root cause of the damage. He argued they had not used what he called a validated, integrated multi-physics analysis. In simpler terms, he believed NASA's models were not capturing the full complexity of what was happening inside the material under real flight conditions. And the phrase he used publicly was this: playing Russian roulette. His estimate, which he stated publicly, was a 1 in 20 chance of disaster, a 95% success rate. Now think about that. You are a human being sitting inside a capsule, flying home from the moon. Someone who flew on the mission to fix the shuttle after Columbia tells you there is a 1 in 20 chance this goes wrong. And there's absolutely nothing you can do about it during those 13 minutes. You cannot steer away from it. You cannot abort. You are committed. Astronaut Victor Glover acknowledged this directly before the flight. He said publicly, and I am quoting the sentiment here, that he had been thinking about entry since April 2023, when the crew was assigned. He said at one of the earliest press conferences, when asked what he was looking forward to, he said splashdown, because that meant they made it back. That is the level of awareness these astronauts carried with them. And former NASA astronaut Dr. Danny Olivas, who served on the independent review team investigating the heat shield issue, did not soften his language either. He told CNN directly, this is a deviant heat shield. There is no doubt about it. This is not the heat shield NASA would want to give its astronauts. He also said he believed NASA had its arms around the problem, but he called it deviant. A former member of NASA's own advisory council, using that word. Now here's what I found most striking when I really dug into this, In January 2026, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman called a special meeting. He gathered heat shield engineers, the chair of the independent review team, senior human spaceflight officials, outside experts, and 2 journalists from Ars Technica were allowed to attend. This was not a routine briefing. This was a room full of the most serious people in American human spaceflight, going through worst-case scenarios. They modeled what would happen if large sections of the avcoat were stripped away entirely during re-entry, and the conclusion was that Orion's titanium framework and thick composite base could keep the crew alive even in that scenario, even if the outer material failed completely. That was the safety margin they were working with, not a theoretical margin of comfort, a real engineering calculation of what happens if the outer layer goes. And the answer was the crew probably survives. Probably. That was the confidence level on the table before 4 human beings were loaded into that capsule. And here is something that was not widely reported. The Camarda letter to NASA's administrator explicitly referenced a pattern. He wrote that history shows accidents occur when organizations convince themselves they understand problems they do not. He was not saying this randomly. He was referencing 2 of the most catastrophic moments in NASA's history. The Challenger disaster in 1986, the Columbia disaster in 2003. Both times engineers raised concerns before the fatal flights. Both times organizational pressure to proceed overrode those concerns. The parallels he was drawing are not subtle, and I think it is important we say that clearly. This is not a smear on NASA. NASA's engineers worked extraordinarily hard on this. They spent years investigating. They ran hundreds of tests. They genuinely believe the modified trajectory solved the problem. But history has shown us more than once that believing you have solved a problem and actually having solved it are not always the same thing. So, what happened? The capsule hit the atmosphere at Mach 33 on April 10, 2026. Mission Control went silent during the 6-minute communication blackout as the capsule was engulfed in a plasma fireball at nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is roughly half the temperature of the visible surface of the Sun. Half the temperature of the Sun, protecting 4 human beings for 13 minutes. And then the parachutes deployed, and then splashed down. 8:07 p.m. Eastern Time. A perfect bullseye splashdown, Mission Control announced. 4 crew, green, all astronauts safe. The families in the viewing room erupted, Mission Control erupted, and the crew emerged from the capsule, healthy, smiling, walking. It worked, but here's what we do not know yet. And this is what matters for what comes next. Divers immediately plunged into the Pacific after splashdown to photograph the heat shield from below. NASA's Orion program manager Howard Hu confirmed 2 heat shield experts were already on the recovery ship USS John P. Murtha waiting. The capsule was hoisted into the well deck for immediate inspection, and Hu said very carefully at the post-splashdown press conference that in the next several days they will make sure they understand if anything happened that was anomalous. That word, anomalous. After a successful splashdown, he did not say everything looked perfect. He said they need to check, because the full picture of what that heat shield went through will only be clear once the capsule is transported back to Kennedy Space Center in Florida for detailed scanning. And what they find there matters enormously, because Artemis III is planned for next year. That mission will not just fly around the moon, it will land on the moon, and then it has to come back. And here is the detail that every person following this program needs to understand. The Artemis III heat shield will be redesigned. NASA has already confirmed that design changes addressing the avcoat permeability problem are planned for Artemis III. A more porous outer layer, better gas venting, the fix that Camarda and others said should have been done before Artemis II, which means NASA is essentially acknowledging through their plans for Artemis III that the Artemis II heat shield was not the ideal design to fly with human beings on board. They flew it anyway. It worked. 4 people are home. And the human story of this mission is genuinely remarkable. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen, they became the first humans to travel toward the moon in more than half a century. They broke Apollo 13's distance record. They photographed the lunar far side from angles never seen before by human eyes. During their closest lunar approach, Wiseman asked Mission Control for permission to name a pair of craters after their capsule and after his late wife Carol. That moment made grown engineers at Mission Control cry. And when the capsule came out of blackout and the parachutes deployed, the flight director said he was chanting "Go, go, go" alone to himself in the control room. This mission delivered things that cannot be measured in technical data, but the technical data will still have to be examined carefully, because the question of what that heat shield looks like right now, sitting on a Navy vessel off the coast of San Diego, is one that will shape the future of human spaceflight. If the inspection comes back clean, it vindicates NASA's decision. It proves the modified trajectory worked. It gives the program confidence to move forward to Artemis III. If it comes back showing unexpected damage, we will need to have a much larger conversation about what was decided and why. And the man who warned about Russian roulette will have been right. So we watch and we wait for those inspection results, because the astronauts survived the reentry. But the story of the heat shield is not over yet. Guys, I will be watching for those inspection reports closely, and we'll be covering any updates as they come in. Everything I do is linked in the end screen. Go have a look. If you want to support the channel and keep me on the pulse of stories like this for you, you know how to find me. Stay safe, guys. Be aware. Bye-bye.